MD Prepper here, discussing the eternal argument of AK versus AR-15 platform rifles. Heard this argument constantly ever since I got into firearms, and frankly it's absurd. It's an absolute absurd argument, and anybody who really has that argument really hasn't put a whole lot of thought into it. And yeah, I know I'm going to get a lot of flack for this video, but oh well, this is the way I feel. This isn't just comparing apples and oranges. This is comparing tanks versus fighter jets, okay? Both are wonderful destructive tools and good at their job, but they're not the same thing. They're not all intended for the same purpose. And these things have a different philosophy behind them. Different philosophy of use, as Nothing Fancy would say. They're just different, and comparing the two is just not fair to either, quite frankly. I'm going to lay out the arguments of both here as I go along, but let's just go ahead and start with the AK and get the AR out of the loop here for a second. The AK is older, so, you know, age before beauty. The AK-47, designed in 1947 by Mikhail Kalashnikov, who was a former, I believe, tank driver. He was in tanks. I can't remember his actual position in a tank. But the man had Russian tanks in mind when he designed this bad boy. This is meant for down in the dirt, in the field use, common use, that sort of thing. Again, designed by a Soviet. Most of the troops in the Soviet army, relatively ignorant peasants and serfs. Well, maybe they weren't serfs at this point, but close enough. He needed a rifle that was easy to use, easy to maintain, cheap to produce for the millions and millions of Russian soldiers out there. That's what the AK is for. This is a peasant rifle. This is low tech. I can train somebody to shoot an AK in a couple hours and maintain it as well. Break it apart as limited as you need to, clean it as limited as you need to, and shoot this thing fairly accurately and fairly reliably. So, this is a tank, okay? Not a strike fighter, not a precision aircraft, okay? It's a good gun. It's just not as modular as the AR. It's nowhere near as modular. And yes, I know there's different stock sets and other things out there, but we're looking at the rifle in its original configuration and general found setup, which would be something like you see right here in this washer. This was, of course, safety check beforehand. But AK is not for everybody, but if I had to go out in the field with a weapon that I was not going to be able to clean or maintain with any kind of frequency, if I was in a constant firefight or some kind of civil unrest, the world's going to hell, EMP or zombie apocalypse, with no time to sit down and break down my weapon and clean it and maintain it, AK all the way. Now the ammo on this, also very different than the AR. Yes, they're both intermediate rounds. There's no such thing as a high-powered assault rifle. They're all intermediate powered by definition. So anytime you hear someone make that absurd argument, shoot them down. There's no such thing as a high-powered assault rifle. At least not really. So, AK, great weapon. Love it. It was my first semi-auto kind of black rifle. I'm still generally partial to the AK, especially with somebody who doesn't know what the heck they're doing. Learning how to shoot, etc. And AR is just a more complicated piece of machinery. It's not worse, it's not better, it's just different. So, if I had to train somebody in a very short time to be proficient with a weapon, I'd probably choose the AK, especially with maintenance and all. I could probably train you in a few hours, probably a day at most, on all the intricacies of an AK that you probably need to know. To shoot it, to maintain it, to sight it in, etc., etc., etc. There's just not much to go wrong with this thing. The round, the 7.62 by 39, which is standard for the AK-47, not necessarily the 74, but it's going to be able to take bigger targets, but at less range overall. If I was out in the woods trying to survive on my own, living in a tent somewhere, probably going to pick the AK. Don't have to maintain it as much if I don't have the time, and I can drop bigger game, deer, larger hogs, etc. I know a bunch of guys out in Texas when I was out there that carried these on their ATVs or in their trucks to deal with the wild hog population out there, because the round hits pretty hard and can take out quite a few hogs relatively quickly. So, this is a tank, okay? It's a rugged, reliable tank, quite literally. Designed by a guy who was in a tank. So that's what you get here. So again, arming the peasants all the way for the AK. Now, moving along. Here's one of my ARs. You've seen this one before. This is my low-cost build with my plumb crazy polymer lower, but this is generic AR. Nothing special about it. I've got others. Let's talk about the AR. The AR-15 was designed by Eugene Stoner, whose initial jobs in the engineering world were in aviation. This guy was into high-end aircraft, okay? This is designed with the modern Joint Strike Fighter mentality involved. Modular, good for multiple roles, could be easily switched out, just like changing out the armaments of a strike fighter. This is for your modern, well-trained, well-equipped shooter or army. I would not take this weapon and give it to some peasant in the middle of Afghanistan and expect this thing to be working 30 years later. Unlike the AKs that were distributed to the Afghans out there, still kicking. I've heard stories of guys taking shoestrings, dumping them in motor oil, and running that through the barrel of an AK and calling it clean enough. You can't abuse this that much. You just can't. This takes training, knowledge, frankly some spare parts laying around if you need it, and time to clean and maintain. That was the big problem in Vietnam. Overall, they had some dirty ammo and some other problems, but the soldiers just weren't maintaining their rifles like they needed to, and they cost them. This just is a little bit more finicky. And yes, I know the piston-driven ones are better. I fired those. Don't have one yet, but this is just a more precision machine, okay? I've even heard this thing called Barbie for boys. Yeah, guys, you got to admit, kind of is Barbie for boys. Highly accessorizable. Can do anything you want to with it. Trade out uppers, trade out lowers, barrels, stocks, grips, magazines, calibers, just anything goes. Sights. It's just modular. Again, Barbie for boys. You can play dress up with this thing. You can dress this thing up any way you want, quickly and efficiently. And that's why this is the top selling style rifle in the United States. Again, we're not a bunch of ignorant peasants living out in the jungle somewhere. So, for your average American who knows their firearms and can handle maintain them and has plenty of time to go home and break their weapon down after a day at the range and clean it up, this is a perfectly fine weapon. It's excellent. There's nothing wrong with it. But it's just not the same as the AK. The versatility is clearly the major advantage you get with the AR-15. You can make it suit your needs, whatever those are. But again, like I said, this requires a more experienced shooter, relatively speaking. Now, here in the United States, we can almost all read and write and have the internet to look up, problems and such with these rifles. But wouldn't give this to some illiterate peasant in the jungle and really expect them to do well with this rifle. Now the round, 5.56 or 223, there's other calibers, but we'll go over the standard stuff. Relatively easy to reload because you're going to shoot brass cased ammo with it compared to the AK, which is generally going to be steel cased. Lighter recoil, better to train the new shooter as far as recoil, especially if you can drop in one of the 22 conversion kits. So very nice overall, but you've got to have somebody who's a little more dedicated to shooting overall, I think, if they want to own an AR, because it's a more complicated machine. Again, that tank versus the jet fighter. With the AK, they used to say if there's something wrong with an AK and you can't fix it with a hammer, just get a bigger hammer. And that won't work with your AR. You've got to be a little more delicate with this thing. Parts and pieces and small springs and all sorts of things. If you're going to tinker around with this, you need to know a little bit more. Not a whole lot more, but relative to the third world, it's a lot more. Longer range, better accuracy in general. Lighter load, smaller bullet, but a wider range of bullets. You can hunt coyotes, you can hunt two-legged varmints, groundhogs, etc. with the different loads in 223 and 5.56 available for this. So again, more versatility, generally longer range, etc. But you don't have quite the punch. In a survival situation, I don't think I'd want to be sitting in a tent somewhere, not cleaning this thing, trying to take down hogs and deer. Smaller hogs you can take down. Deer, generally illegal. An SHTF, you're not going to care, but I'd hate to shoot my deer and have it run off and not be able to find it. So, good gun, but again, it's not an AK, and neither is an AK this. They're just designed for different purposes. I see the arguments all the time, like I said, and I always laugh. I just think it's funny. It's like comparing your 45 and your 22. They both have their purpose, and these are probably a little closer in purpose than others, but different mentality entirely. Most of the world is not that well educated and living in third world conditions, or at least not first world conditions. In the United States, nothing wrong with this. If I had to go traipsing through the jungle, probably going to go for the AK. But again, I just get tired of hearing the argument and finally decide to give my views. Go ahead and let the spamming commence and let people disagree. But I think I've laid a fairly good argument out. And always remember, tank versus jet fighter. Both are great. Sometimes you need one, sometimes you need the other. Really, you need both. So what's the better answer, AK versus AR? The answer is buy both. They're great weapons, and you'll enjoy them both if you're a real shooter. Andy Prepper out.